It is with great pleasure that I'd like to introduce Boris Dittrich, LGBT Advocacy Director for the Human Rights Watch. As director, Boris organized several talks at the United Nations, which resulted in a joint statement by nearly 70 countries to combat discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. Previously, Boris was a member of the Dutch Parliament and initiated same-sex marriage and adoption bills that resulted in the Netherlands becoming the first country in the entire world to open up civil marriage for members of the LGBT community. Please join me in welcoming Boris.
Well, thank you very much for being here, and thank you for the people watching. It's really a pleasure to be here at Google. I was here a few months ago, I believe, and I recognize several of the faces that were there last time. So I hope I will not say the same thing as the last time. But thank you very much for being here. As you said, Cynthia, in your introduction, I work for Human Rights Watch. We are a very big international human rights organization. We have about 300 staff members. And we work in many countries in the world, over 90 countries in the world. And we have offices in San Francisco. Here is our director, Andrea Steele, from the San Francisco office. But we also have our main office in New York, and of course in Europe, in Africa, and shortly also in Brazil we will open an office. So we work in all parts of the world. And the core of our work is actually to investigate human rights abuses. We report about them, and then we expose what we have found, and we try to have an impact by doing our advocacy work, by going to governments in those countries saying, hey, listen, you have to change your laws, you have to change your policies. We go to the United Nations, for instance, where we present our findings. We go to the African Union, the African Commission, we go to the Organization of American States, and so we try to have impact so that these human rights abuses we have found will stop, because, as you know, a lot of human rights abuses take place. Now, I'm the Advocacy Director of the LGBT Rights Program within Human Rights Watch. We also have a women's rights program, a children's rights program. We cover a lot of issues. So I'm here to talk to you today about LGBT rights and what we do in the world to try to improve the situation of the LGBT community everywhere in the world. I think, to make it a little bit more personal, I think I will start with my coming out story, because that shows you why I'm actually so motivated to do this work. And I always like to share that story when I'm in San Francisco. So in 1974, I was living in the Netherlands. I finished my high school and I got a grant, a Fulbright grant, to come to the US to study. So I went to a university in Ohio in 1974. I did my freshman year there, and I had a girlfriend. And we decided to hitchhike to San Francisco, because that's the city where everything happened in the 70s and the 60s. So we came to San Francisco, and we stayed in a very cheap hotel and walked around. And in that hotel there were some students, gay students. And he said, you know what, why don't you come with us to the Castro area, to the Castro Street, because it's nice, and we know this guy there, and he's doing a lot for the neighborhood. So why don't you come along? And Melissa didn't want to come along with him. She wanted to go to the zoo in San Francisco. But I thought, yeah, you know, I like those gay students, and why don't we? So we ended up with them, and we went to the Castro Street, and we went into this shop, and there was this guy, and he was talking about community work and things like that. And it was quite kind of interesting, and we were having a Coke, and all of a sudden, you know, in the middle of this conversation, he looked at me, and then he did like this, and he said, you are gay. And I was so deep in the closet at the time, and Melissa, my girlfriend, was sitting next to me. I said, no, you know, and I was blushing, and anyway, so I denied it, and a few minutes later we left and we went to the zoo, and I don't remember anything from the zoo, but later, years and years later, I was watching a documentary on television, And then I realized that this guy who outed me in front of Melissa, and we broke up shortly after our San Francisco trip, but that guy was Harvey Milk. And so that was actually the connection that I thought at the time when I saw that documentary. I was a lawyer in Amsterdam, and I thought, God, this guy, he is really amazing. He did so much for the LGBT community. So that inspired me to think, you know what, in my career as a lawyer, I want to also take up a lot of cases for people from the LGBT community. Later I became a judge and then member of parliament. And so I've always in my career tried to focus on LGBT rights because I thought it's very important. And as you said, Cynthia, in 1994, when it was the first time I was elected as national member of Congress in the Netherlands, I came up with the idea to introduce the same-sex marriage bill. And a long story, but in 2001, the first same-sex marriage bill ever in the world was implemented. So last April 2011, it was 10 years ago that we celebrated the 10 years anniversary of same-sex marriage. And now it's very interesting because now I live in New York, and as you know, today it's Thursday, but hopefully tomorrow there will be a vote in New York in the Senate, the state Senate, about the same-sex marriage bill there. And I'm really hopeful that we will have a majority, and then New York will be the next state in the US that will introduce same-sex marriage, and hopefully, of course, California will follow sometime. Depends, of course, on all those court cases and other issues, but let's hope that also in California people can get married in a certain period of time. But going back to my work for Human Rights Watch, you know, so this was really my motivation, because I saw also as Member of Parliament that everywhere in the world people who belong to the LGBT community face tremendous difficulties. You must know that the United Nations has 192 member states. Now guess how many countries criminalize homosexual conduct out of those 192? Do you have any idea?
About 85, right?
Oh, you have done your homework. About 85 criminalize homosexual conduct. And I will give you an example what that means, because it sounds very vague. But we did research in the country of Cameroon in Africa, where homosexual conduct is criminalized. And Human Rights Watch did that research together with 2 Cameroonian organizations. And so we interviewed victims, witnesses, policemen, and we wrote that in the report. And then I came to Cameroon, and we presented the report to the Prime Minister and the Minister of Justice of Cameroon. And we told them, listen, in your law it says homosexual conduct is forbidden, is criminalized, and you can get a prison sentence for it. But what happens in reality is that when you have a fight with your neighbors, for instance, people can phone the police, and the police comes and they arrest you for being homosexual. So there's nothing, you haven't been caught in the act. No, just for being gay or lesbian, you can go to prison. And I told the Prime Minister, and this is really a violation of international human rights standards. You cannot criminalize people for just being who they are. And he said, I didn't know this was going on in my country. I didn't know. So he took the report and he promised to look at it. We went later on, we went to Geneva, and we spoke to the United Nations Human Rights Committee. And they, after our presentation, they came up with recommendations to the government of Cameroon to decriminalize, to take it out of their law. But I'm going to give you now a concrete example of what it means. About 2 months ago, there was this man, a gay man in Cameroon, and on a dating site, he met somebody, and so they wanted to meet in person. So they said, why don't we meet in the lobby of a hotel, and we'll take it from there. So he sent this text message to this other guy, and when he came to the hotel, he was arrested, because the other guy apparently worked for the police, so it was entrapment, and he was arrested. And he was taken to the police station and then to court. and he received a prison sentence of, guess how long he has to stay in prison? 3 years. 3 years for simply sending a text message. So he is in prison 3 years. And Human Rights Watch, every time I'm talking about this, I can get really angry. So we send letters to the government, we send letters to members of parliament, and we are putting pressure on the government of Cameroon to really stop this and really change its course and get it out of the criminalization, out of the penal code. Now, one of the possibilities we have as international human rights organization to put pressure on governments is also to work in the UN. And today it's, what date is it today? 16th. Is it the 16th or the 17th?
16th.
Tomorrow, Friday the 17th of June, in Geneva at Human Rights Council of the UN, there will be an historic moment because South Africa has introduced a resolution, so a formal motion, in which it says we have to stop violence against people of the LGBT community all over the world, and we have to really stop discrimination. So South Africa, in this resolution, asks the rest of the world to support the content of the resolution and to ask the High Commissioner for Human Rights to make an investigation and to come up with recommendations how the LGBT community all over the world will be recognized and that their rights are being recognized as human rights like everybody else's rights. So that's a major development because, you know, like I said, 85 countries in the world criminalize homosexual conduct. And it's very important that those countries will realize that homosexuality is not a Western concept which is imposed on them by some Western countries or the US. No, in this case it's South Africa who's taking the lead and says, listen, we cannot go on like this in the world. We have to realize that human rights are universal. Human rights are for everybody and not for only heterosexual people or, you know, for white people or black people. No, universal human rights are really universal. Not sometimes, but always, night and day. You have to understand that human rights are yours. So that's a major development. Tomorrow will be the vote in the UN, and we are confident that the High Commissioner, who has to do these investigations, where are all these human rights violations taking place, she will use the reports Human Rights Watch has produced over the years. And when you look here at the table, I brought some reports so you can really see how it looks like, but we have here a report about the LGBT community in Iran, in Cameroon, in Senegal. We have reports, a very interesting report about transgender people in Honduras, where unfortunately a lot of people have been killed on the street, transgender people who did sex work because they couldn't find another job, and over 60 people have been murdered. And after our report came out, we sent it to the government there. And we protested a few months ago again when other people were murdered. And we sent a letter to the government and said, listen, this cannot go on. You have to investigate this. And you have to stop the murders on transgender people. Unfortunately, the Minister of Justice of Honduras, after he received the letter, said, yes, we are going to investigate. So now there is this committee looking into all those murders and also the role of police in Honduras in terms of the murders of transgender people. Now, my program at Human Rights Watch, we are overwhelmed by all these human rights violations everywhere in the world, and we are a small program, so we cannot take on everything that's happening, so we have to make choices. I will tell you a little bit about 3 reports that are coming out because I think they are very relevant and very important. The first is about lesbian women and gender non-conforming women in South Africa. Unfortunately, in South Africa, a lot of lesbian or gender non-conforming women are raped by gangs of men or sometimes by individual men. It's called, quote unquote, corrective rape, because often those men, they give as reason why they raped a woman that they wanted to correct their behavior because they looked too much like a man, for instance, in their appearance or in the way their haircut was taking place. So they wanted to correct the women by raping them, which is ridiculous, of course. And what Human Rights Watch has done is we interviewed many, many women who were the victims of this corrective rape. And we interviewed witnesses, and we put all that in a report with a legal analysis, of course, about the way the police is helping or not helping women in South Africa who face this violence. Unfortunately, many women have been killed after being raped. So that's all in a report, and we are going to produce that within a few months in South Africa, together with South African women's rights groups and other groups, in order to have as much impact as possible. Because corrective rape, as it's called, it doesn't only happen in South Africa, also in other countries it takes place. So we can use the report also in other countries to really go to the government and say, listen, you really have to do something against this. So that is one report about lesbian and gender non-conforming women. Second report, which is almost finished, is about the Netherlands. And as you can tell from my accent, I'm from the Netherlands. And people think, because the Netherlands was the first country in the world where the same-sex marriage was introduced, that this is some kind of paradise for the LGBT community. Well, unfortunately, I have to shatter that dream. It's not true. When you are a transgender person in the Netherlands, you are faced with a terrible discrimination, because in the Dutch law, in the civil code, it says that when you become somebody of the other gender, as a transgender person, you also want to have new identification documents. Now, in the Dutch law, it says you can only get a new ID after you have had sex reassignment surgery and you have become infertile permanently. So the law requires you to change your body completely and make yourself infertile. And that is a violation of international human rights standards. So I thought nobody knows about this. And the Netherlands is always on the forefront when it comes to LGBT rights in the world, but they never talk about the T, never talk about transgender rights. So we've done research. We interviewed a lot of transgender people, male to female and female to male, and we put that in the report and their stories. And in September we're going to launch the report in the Netherlands, and hopefully we will be able to persuade the Dutch government to change the law. And we believe that report is very important because, of course, the Netherlands is part of the European Union. 27 countries are member states of the EU. But several others have the same type of law as the Netherlands. So what goes for the Netherlands also goes for Germany, for instance. And so one report might have a double impact in other countries, and hopefully that will be some kind of ball rolling, and we can really improve the rights, the human rights of transgender people in that part of the world, and maybe later somewhere else. So these are two reports that are coming up. But we do more than only writing reports, although that is the core of our work. We also have a film festival, and we try to select at our Human Rights Watch Film Festival topics, documentaries about issues that are really relevant. And this year we've selected a movie about bullying and harassment at school of young people, not only LGBT people, but in general. And I was on the selection committee of the film festival, so I've seen the rough cut of that documentary. And it's really, really gruesome when you realize how young kids amongst each other can be so violent and intolerant. But not only young kids amongst each other, but it's also teachers who look the other way when something happens because they don't know how to react, or school boards who do not want to talk about those problems because they are afraid they would lose students and money and whatever. So there are all kinds of reasons not to step in and to stop intolerance at schools. And so we are going to select that movie, and we are going to present it in one of our film festivals. And then we organize also questions and answers, you know, with parents and students and other relevant people who are working in the educational field, in order to try to influence, to stop suicides, to stop isolation of young LGBT people and other students who are being harassed and bullied upon. So this was a short overview of part of the work we do. I could talk for hours, but I think it would be a good idea to see if you have questions and if I can answer them. Yes, please, go ahead.
So you mentioned earlier that you had what criteria do you take into consideration when trying to prioritize? Because I think, you know, at Google we face this question when we have how do you choose?
Yeah, well, so my program is mainly focusing on countries where the LGBT community is in a very difficult situation. The first criterion is actually that people should ask for our help. So we work together with groups on the ground in such a country. Because there might be some countries where they say, no, please stay out of here, because it might cause a backlash if an international organization as Human Rights Watch will do research and write a report. So we try to work together with people on the ground, and after we've written our report and presented it, they can use that for advocacy purposes in their country, and that can take years and years that they're using that report, because unfortunately it doesn't happen that a government reads the report and the next day they are going to open up the prison doors and let all the gay men or lesbian women out. No, it doesn't work like that, unfortunately. So working together with people in that country is very important, and we also look where we can do meaningful research. So in a country like Iran, it's very difficult for Human Rights Watch to enter Iran and to interview people because, you know, it's so dangerous. So what we did with our Iran report is that we went to Turkey, and a lot of gay, lesbian, transgender Iranians, they left the country and they fled to Turkey and were waiting in camps in order to be relocated to other third countries. So we interviewed them there about the situation in Iran. So we had first-hand information, but not in Iran collected, but elsewhere. And it's true that we are actually always looking for funding, because there are so many problems in the world, and our work really has impact, but we need money to do that. So Human Rights Watch doesn't accept any government funding, because we want to be completely independent, because usually in our reports and in our advocacy work, we have to say to governments, listen, you are violating human rights treaties, for instance. So we are always criticizing governments and stimulating them to change their laws and policies. So no government funding. That means that we are dependent on individual donors or foundations, for instance. So if you know people who really believe in our international LGBT work, it would be wonderful if you could just ask them to support us financially. And yeah, that would be a great help. Who else? Yes.
Is your organization involved in the situation in Uganda at all? Or?
Yes, very much so. I will repeat the question. How about Uganda, and is Human Rights Watch involved in Uganda? Yes, we are. We have a researcher. She lives in Kampala, Uganda. She knows everybody there. She's living there already for some years. And I myself are on the board of advisors of the Sexual Minorities Uganda organization, SMUG it's called. And let me tell you a story. About 3 years ago, in 2008, I was invited by David Cato, a human rights defender, to come to Uganda, and he wanted to introduce me to a lot of people of the LGBT community. So I went to Uganda and talked with him, and we met people, and so I familiarized myself with the problems of the LGBT community there. And later on I went to the government and I spoke to the Minister of Interior about discrimination of the LGBT community. And the minister said, human rights? We don't care about human rights. We have other problems to attend to. So it was a really difficult situation in Uganda. And there is a connection between the US and Uganda in the sense that conservative religious groups from the US export homophobia to Uganda. They adopt churches, they send a lot of money to those churches, and so they're spreading homophobia and also the idea that homosexuals might take over the country. And they're talking about the homosexual danger. And so there was this American minister who gave a course in Kampala talking about homosexual danger, and one of his students was a member of parliament, and this member of parliament got so inspired by what he heard about the homosexual danger that he drafted a bill. It's called the Anti-Homosexuality Bill, and he included even the death penalty for specific kinds of homosexual behavior. Now this bill was almost adopted a few months ago in Parliament, but it has been postponed. But this Mr. Bahati, the Member of Parliament, has been re-elected, and in interviews he said, I'm going to reintroduce the Anti-Homosexuality Bill as soon as Parliament in Uganda reconvenes. So in a few months' time we will probably face the situation again that we really have to call for international pressure on the Ugandan government, not, if the bill will be accepted, not to implement it, because you know, it's outrageous what's happening there. And unfortunately David Kato was murdered a few months ago because he was a leading force against this anti-homosexuality bill, and he was murdered. So it's very dangerous to be out and open in a country like that. Yes.
You were saying that, I mean, a lot of those opinions are spawned by religious impact from the U.S. So how do you bring, I mean, your research back to U.S. grounds? Because, I mean, a lot of it is, it sounds like, starts in the U.S. and it's brought to some of these countries through religious groups. So how can your work have impact here, and how does it have impact here?
Well, the question is the relation between the US, homophobia, and in those countries, and how Human Rights Watch can do research and how we can influence that this stops in the US. Well, I don't want to suggest that, you know, countries in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, or in the Caribbean, or in some Asian states, there's no homophobia there, and then all of a sudden some conservative religious groups from the US enter the country, and all of a sudden homosexuality will be criminalized. No, of course there's fertile ground in those countries already. What we did, because everywhere I go when I talk to ministers of governments in those countries, usually they say, when they don't want to talk about the issue, they say, well, listen, homosexuality is a Western concept, and we don't have any discrimination because we don't know any gay men or lesbian women. They're invisible, so there is no problem. And if there is a problem, then it's because it's Western tourists or whatever coming to our country and introducing this kind of behavior, and it's against our culture, against our tradition, against our religion, and therefore it's not from us. So we don't want it. So to counter that, because it's nonsense of course, we did research and we wrote a report. And in this report we found that actually in all those countries the law that's criminalizing homosexual conduct is actually derived from the old UK law, the Victorian law, which was brought by the UK as colonizer several centuries ago, for instance in India, but also in many Caribbean countries or African countries. And so it's not homosexual conduct that has been imported by the West. No, it has, what has been imported is the homophobia and the homophobic laws. as some kind of derelict of colonialism. So with that report, we can counter that argument. But it's true that there are some very conservative, homophobic US groups really targeting specific countries, where they build churches, where they adopt churches and send a lot of interns there, a lot of money, and spreading this homophobic word. There are also groups here in the US, of course, who are trying to expose that. But I'm talking about it because we really see this influence. And we see that messages of intolerance usually, resonate in countries where the economic situation is terrible, when elections are coming, because a lot of politicians need a scapegoat, and unfortunately the LGBT community is often used as a scapegoat. For instance, in Uganda, where there is extreme poverty, where there is this issue of children being abducted to become child soldiers, for instance. Why don't politicians talk about those terrible issues? And why do they all of a sudden start talking about the homophobic danger, the homo danger, as they call it? So, yeah, there is a lot of influence, and we have to expose that. But of course, you really have to come with facts. So we are working on that. Yes.
I was curious as to how Human Rights Watch balances advocacy for LGBT communities in places that have more general deprivation of rights. For instance, in Russia, there's been a lot of crackdown on the right of LGBT people to assemble and protest, have a pride parade, but more broadly, Russians are not allowed to assemble. So how does an organization like yours advocate for both of those communities? Or, I understand that there's obviously overlap, but do you think that in a lot of these countries there's, I don't want to suggest that there's sort of a hierarchy of rights, but it seems to me that there are some more fundamental rights that might be more prioritized.
Let me rephrase your question, which is difficult, but let me rephrase it like, where do LGBT rights and advocacy for LGBT rights, where does that fit in within the larger abuses of human rights in a specific country? And you mentioned Russia as an example. Well, it's a very, very good question. Of course, we also think about that often. Human Rights Watch is a mainstream human rights organization. So, like I said, we have all kind of themes we are working on and geographical divisions in our organization. So it's Human Rights Watch that is exposing specific human rights violations in a specific country. And sometimes when we talk about the freedom of assembly, for instance, which is an example you gave, we write a report, but we can highlight it, for instance, when people in Moscow want to demonstrate and there is a crackdown by the police, and the police sides actually with neo-Nazi groups that are fighting the LGBT movement that wanted to demonstrate. So when we write a report about that, we can use that as an example of the larger issue. But we have an office in Moscow, and our office in Moscow is on a daily basis involved in trying to fight human rights abuses and all kinds of topics. So sometimes you're now talking to the advocacy director of the LGBT rights division, but tomorrow could be somebody here from Human Rights Watch working for health and human rights, for instance, and they might have different examples they can give, but they also take place in Russia. So we are aiming from different angles, aiming at the government to uphold international human rights treaties, and Russia signed treaties. Russia is part of the Council of Europe and is obliged to respect the freedom of assembly, for instance, and they don't. So we have to expose that.
Do you think that actually trying to advocate for those from those different angles can actually discredit the broader fight for human rights. Because, for instance, the Russian government could say, well, Human Rights Watch, yes, they want freedom of assembly, but they also want it for the gays, and that's really their angle or something like that.
No, that doesn't happen. Here we also have on the table a world report. So every year we produce a report, usually in January, where we write about the state of human rights in the world. And so we have chapters per country. And when you look at the chapter of Russia, for instance, you see all kind of issues where Russia violates international human rights standards. And if the Russian government then says, for instance, we're not going to talk about all these things, but they also talk about the freedom of assembly for LGBT people, then it discredits the credibility of the Russian government. And the Russian government needs to adhere to recommendations from the Council of Europe, for instance, which they don't. So that's not really an issue. No. Yes.
I was just curious, would love to hear if you have if your group has done any sort of recent reports or work findings on the situation in the United States, because I think it's important to hear about what's going on in the world. It is a universal human right, but we never look in our own backyard, I feel. So I'm just kind of curious what's happening here.
So the question is, how about the United States and human rights violations in the US? Well, that's why we are actually based also in New York, and we have offices here in San Francisco, also in Chicago, in Washington. We have a big office because we have a body of work about human rights violations in the US itself. So we even have a division in Human Rights Watch that's dealing with the US, and we produce a lot of reports about, for instance, the rights of prisoners in the US, or HIV/AIDS care in a specific state. So you name it, and when it's a human rights violation here in California, we have a report about juveniles, for instance, who get life without the possibility of parole. So if you're 16 and you murder somebody in a specific situation, you can be sentenced for a life imprisonment here in the state of California, and you're never going to get out of prison, which is a violation of international standards. So we have reports about rape kits, for instance. When a woman is raped and they take DNA, and then this whole package is going to a police station, and then there is not enough personnel and nothing is done with the rape kit, so the rape cases cannot be solved. So we write reports about that, in order to try to make impact. And so there are many human rights violations in the US itself that we expose.
Sorry, I meant very particularly if you could talk about any recent findings or reports that you've done in regards to LGBT issues or violations in the U.S.
Oh, I'm sorry, about LGBT violations of the U.S. in the U.S. Well, we have to choose our priorities, and because there are many LGBT organizations in the US who are looking at the US and what do they do wrong or not, that we believe that we should use our resources for countries like Cameroon, for instance, or Senegal, or Jamaica, or in the Asian Pacific region. So we support other organizations. I write op-eds about Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or about same-sex marriage, or the DOMA legislation, for instance. But we're not focusing on those issues because we believe that there are other organizations who have funding to do that, and we shouldn't duplicate what others can do. So we really look for countries where homosexual conduct, for instance, is criminalized, and where people are not even allowed to organize themselves because the organization is also illegal, and people will end up in prison. Yes.
How do you go from writing this report to actually getting in touch with the chief executives or presidents or whatever of these various countries, and then from there, what is your involvement from their
receiving that recommendation to actually taking action?
Yeah.
How does that whole process actually?
So you're asking about the advocacy process once we have a report. How do we get access to government officials, and how do we get impact?
Because I imagine if they weren't terribly sort of LGBT friendly to begin with, like I just wouldn't meet with you.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that's why it's so good that Human Rights Watch, as mainstream human rights organization working in over 90 countries in the world, has a lot of impact. As example, in 1997, Human Rights Watch was part of a group that received the Nobel Peace Prize for our work. So all over the world, governments know about Human Rights Watch, and they don't like to be criticized, because what we do when we have those findings, we expose them and we say, listen, this is an international, this is a breach of international treaties, and you have to change your laws. People don't like that at all, and so usually they want to meet with us to hear what are those findings and what can we do with it, or how can we deny it, but they meet with us. And so in an individual state, we have meetings with governments, or otherwise we turn to members of parliament. Sometimes in countries they don't want to meet with us, then we turn to journalists in order to get the story out. And usually people, when they read the reports and understand what kind of abuses are taking place, something starts, in such a country, and sometimes there start a movement of trying to change laws and policies. If that doesn't work, the United Nations is there, the Human Rights Council, or the Council of Europe. So there are all kind of international, intergovernmental bodies where we look for allies with other countries, other states, in order to put pressure on such a government. And this naming and shaming of a country that violates international human rights standards is, it's very practical and it works. May I suggest you have the last question? Yes.
So, getting back to where we are at the moment, can you give some insight into what a multinational company like Google, which has offices in some of these countries, how much we can do, and maybe some recommendations on what activities Google can do to help out some of these human rights issues? I know that we, for example, sponsor, for example, Pride in Warsaw or Think Dot in Singapore, and those are important, and some people proud when Google does that. But are there other things that we're not doing that a company like Google could do to help out the situation?
Yeah, so your question is, what can a company like Google or employees within a company like Google can do to, let's say, improve LGBT rights all around the world? The first thing that comes to mind, of course, is support the work organizations like Human Rights Watch are doing in order to improve that, because we are here to try to help people in other countries, and we are the experts. We have our networks in those countries, so we can do the work to have that impact. But like I said before, we need to have funding to do so. So that would be on an individual basis. Of course, if you think it's important, you can give a donation, and in that way you can help our work. But also to spread the word, and of course you people here at Google, you know exactly how internet works, and you're all on Facebook and whatever. So we have a website, www.hrw.org, and on this Human Rights Watch website you'll find all our reports or public letters or press releases. So the press release about what's happening with South Africa and the resolution tomorrow at the Human Rights Council, you will find it on our website tomorrow, and you can spread the word to your networks. And that is important, because what I've found is that, and a lot of people don't even know that when you send a text message in another country in the world, you can end up in prison for 3 years. People don't know about it, and we take our freedom here for granted. And it's not. I mean, people here 50 years ago were starting to fight for rights in order to have the freedom we are having now. So spreading the word is, I think, very, very important. And of course, there are a lot of volunteers. People like to volunteer for organizations like Human Rights Watch. Andrea, our director, is organizing every year a Human Rights Watch dinner, for instance, where we introduce human rights defenders from other parts of the world who are real heroes. We introduce them to the American public here in San Francisco, in the Yoshi Theater, I believe, right? And so you can help as a volunteer to make this dinner possible, and ask your friends to come and to donate. So there are different ways to help an organization like Human Rights Watch. I would like to ask Andrea to come up and say maybe a little bit about the organization and the office here in San Francisco, and if you live in the Bay Area, how you can get involved with Human Rights Watch. Well, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you all for having us here today. As Boris mentioned, we do have a very robust committee here in the Bay Area, focusing, as Boris said, on a whole variety of issues, human rights issues that we cover. Our LGBT work is very important to us, and we have a great constituency, as you might imagine, here in the Bay Area. So I do encourage you, if you are interested and would like to help us spread the word. I think, as Boris says, we are a human rights organization, and part of our mandate is to build the human rights movement. We might think that is something that is easy and natural, but you and I know that there are a lot of people who don't know what's happening in 85 countries. And that is really part of what we do. That's why we get Boris out here when he's here, and to speak and to really educate the public. So if you know of speaking opportunities, that is very helpful. Again, if you know of other people who might be interested in this work, that's really helpful. And I encourage you to please talk to me, go to our website, we have a San Francisco page, get involved in our work, because it really is meaningful and we're really making a difference. So thank you very much.